Here is a purple ink by Sailor Bungubox Tipsy.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Not all inks made by Sailor can be winners. I was, in general, so disappointed. I took my notes for this video with Private Reserve's Infinity Purple instead. Much better. The tone is frequently too light to be a standalone color on a page, but its performance to me does better on non-fountain pen friendly paper because they can often darken and ink some, and this ink needs it.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M805. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a light grayish purple. It's blah to look at. Now, it does have no feathering and it has no spread, and we can spot a few places that have some shading. Now, you see the shading show up in back, the first line. It starts lighter, gets darker again at the K. It's this on the second line is a bit darker than was next to it. Unfortunately, what I largely see is a lot of a much lighter tone that just isn't very pleasant on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's nothing particularly interesting about this tone on the page to me. It is a purple, yet really gets overpowered by kind of gray elements in the ink. No feather, no spread. It does threaten to shade just a little bit when you look at threatened on the third line, starting a little darker, lightening up in the middle of the word, darkening again at the end of the end ed. Again, it's I'm looking at this and just dumbfounded by how unnice it is. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has shading that looks better than it did in the other two nibs. Not something to get angry about how it did with the other two, but looking at angry here, you see the A is a little bit darker, the N a little lighter, the G gets dark, the R to Y is lighter, and the end of the Y quite a bit darker. Puzzling indeed, looking at puzzled, that starts light, gets dark, starts dark, gets light at the U, darkens up through some of the G's and L, lightens a little bit with the E into the D, ending darker on the up and down stroke of the D. I'm thinking it's looking some of its nicest here on this page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There were approximately 11 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading. It would happen when you look at wood on the third line, starting lighter, working its way darker to the L and lightening up again at the D, where take starts off lighter and becomes darker as you get to the KE at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is some shading that's going on. You see it a little bit in Villages, where it's mostly a lighter tone with a darker S, really contrasted by the to the left of that word. Goblins underneath is really doing the same thing. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. Instead of doing nothing, we look at instead where the dot of the I is very dark. The first letters are quite light. The TE get dark, lightening up a little bit at the A in the beginning of the D, and the up and down stroke of the D getting quite a bit darker. Don't be a prisoner to what this is doing. Looking at prisoners, that starts lighter, starts darker. I'm just trying to really put some energy into this. Starts darker and works its way lighter, darkens up just a little bit on the N to the E, lightening up again on the R, darker again at the S. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, thank goodness that this paper is having kind of an effect on this ink. It's darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's easier to read than on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, has some shading. You see the on the second line, starts lighter, gets darker into the he. Where wargs, the W starts lighter and gets darker at the end part of the W. Into the AR, lightens up a bit for the G, darkening again at the S. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine, about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, because it was a very gray-leaning, dusty kind of purple before, we don't really see a tone change, though we don't see the purple elements of this ink, considering it's supposed to be a purple ink, but this paper does tend to affect some inks. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is probably the best shading this ink is going to give in this case. Take a look at that and they and said on the second line. A lot of tone shifting back and forth from lighter and darker tones, practically letter by letter. Looking pretty good here. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still more of a very gray than any kind of a purple as a result of the paper, with no feathering, no spread. There's only a few moments of shading that you can understand. Looking at understand on the third line, you see it starts lighter. The R gets a little bit darker. The S lightening up. The T showing some of the dark tones again, lightening out of that until you get to the end of the D. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, and I would be surprised if I did.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get only a light peppering of shading. More, this ink is not stand out on the page enough to make those vertical lines kind of disappear. Really, you practically see the vertical lines that are there on this quad rule more than you do the ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with pretty good shading here. It wasn't really so much a standout shader on the Clairfontaine, although it was there. I think it is showing itself a little bit nicer as a shading here. Yet, looking at yet on the first line, you see that the Y is lighter than the E, and it lightens up out of the E into the T that's quite a bit darker. It didn't escape the shading. Looking at escape, that starts lighter, working its way darker, and then lightens up at the D. So it really is doing something. And when you get to through on the fourth line, the H is quite a bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Lighter than on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with less shading than we had with the medium. The thing I'm picking up on here is some of those vertical lines are breaking this ink up a little bit. You see it in very on the first line where it just can't get through that. Same with tall on the second line, wolves on the third line, the ground below on the fourth line. Not a good match here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Cross Violet. Here is Diamine Lilac Night. Here is Lamy Beryl. Here is Monteverde Amethyst. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really making it to look at. There's no word for it, only the sound effect of It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. It's the shading parts that draw your attention to the fact that there is writing on the page. The writing is hiding behind the quad rule of the paper, and while it's hiding, it's going because it's gross. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is some shading that's going on. You see it a little bit. It stands there some. You see among is on the first line is darker than the word struck on the second line, immediately followed by the word immediately underneath it, where you see in the middle of the M's it gets a little bit darker, and the second M to E a little bit darker, lightening up out, but the cross of the T very dark. Nothing shaggy, like you're not getting any kind of the feathering, but looking at the word shaggy, the S is lighter, very light, the H gets to a readable tone, the A, G, and most of the second G a bit too light. But as you come out of that second G into the Y, it becomes readable again. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading that's not doing horribly. Looking at horribly, starts dark, lightens up at the O, gets dark on the first R, lightens up again on the second R, stays lighter until you get to the B, where it starts to darken a little bit, much darker at the Y. Another thing about this is the word another, either on the first or the second line, where it starts light and works its way darker again the whole way through. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is Diatramentis Jane Austen Dark Green.
Here is Pelican Edelstein Moonstone.
Here is Diamine Hope Pink. Here is Sailor Studio number 670. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering, we get spread, but neither of them are any kind of a real issue. They're actually an aid to this ink on this paper. I think it looks better here with the tiny bit of feathers that occur that are unavoidable. The little spread, but the darker tone all come together, making this a usable ink here. Now, we do get moments of shading, but who cares? I can actually read it and it doesn't hurt my eyes. That's where this gets better. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine with feathering, with spread. Neither of those are any kind of a real issue for this ink. It actually is doing very well here, all things considered. Again, this paper that is normally toilet paper is bringing out some nicer qualities of this ink. Does it shade? Yes, it does. You see it in the D of and, T of feet. It's there. It's not the quality that matters for this ink, since generally it's kind of hard to read. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium. And I say a little, I mean the tiniest bit. It's quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering and there is spread, and just with the other two, I don't see the feather or the spread in this case being a bad thing. I think this ink could be a really good ink for this paper. Then they would just need to make it in a different color that doesn't go when you look at it. It does shade. Now you see it in Fright. The F is a little bit darker than the RI and beginning of the G, and it darkens up again into the GHT. Not to be dwarfed by what's seen in Bilbo. I know you thought I was going to say dwarves, but Bilbo on the third line starts a light or darker, lightens up at the I, very dark at the L, lightens up out of the B into the O, and darkens just at the end of the O. Looking at the back of the page, did I say this was a good ink for 20-pound copy paper or what? There's almost nothing for ghosting. You could write on the back of this page and not destroy your notes. This ink, I wish they just said it was made for 20-pound toilet paper. I mean, copy paper. Nothing bled through to the other side. This could be a great ink if you insist on using copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
In the extra fine, it is just too light to be left alone. The same problem with the medium. At least it does darken up a bit in the stub. I think what we have here is a case where a fire hose of a fine is needed just to get it dark enough to easily read. Loss of shading. There's no loss of shaving. I'm not shaving. Loss of shading be damned. Or put it in the pen of someone else. Ooh, and one more thing. Forget it. Just forget this ink.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.